And that's really what I want to do today, is just help you better understand what we mean when we talk about escaping to fantasy, why people from complex trauma do it, and what healthy looks like. So let me begin with the definition. It's said to be a self-protective coping mechanism used by many abuse victims. It's a way of mentally or emotionally leaving the situation or spacing out to enter a fantasy world. And this often helps to anesthetize the person by relieving their present pain. So another way just to say that is a person is escaping something painful. And that could be their circumstances, but it could also be themselves. And we're going to develop that. Or it could be painful emotions that they're wanting to escape. And so it's trying to make all these negative feelings go away and replace them with positive. And so fantasy becomes their way of doing that. Some people, as younger people or even adults, still escape to fantasy about becoming somebody great, a movie star, the most popular person in the class, the one that everybody wants to date. And the fantasy world is where they escape to feeling important and feeling loved. Some people, when they go through sexual abuse, they're escape out of their body-like experience so that they're not even conscious of it happening to them. It sometimes feels like it's happening to somebody else. Let me read something that somebody wrote. Relying on fantasy, daydreaming as escapism, I suffer from avoidant personality disorder as well as depression, low self-esteem. And over the past couple of years, a way that I have dealt with it is to use fantasy. I started off with occasionally imagining myself as a different person and daydreaming about being in positive situations. But over the years, the fantasies have become more detailed, with the person I imagine having a totally different name, life, etc. It's gotten to the point where I imagine these fantasies every single day, and have trouble sleeping if I'm not imagining myself as this other person. I'm fully aware that it's all fantasy, but the degree that I've come to rely on it scares me, and I've never heard of anyone else with this kind of problem. I'm afraid to talk to a therapist about it because I'm afraid of what he or she would think of me. Signed, Dreamer. So hopefully those examples help you understand what I'm talking about by this escape to fantasy. I need to say up front that there are healthy escapes into fantasy. They're not all unhealthy. So let me just give you examples of healthy escapes into fantasy. All of us, young, old, we still go into our imaginations and we imagine a different world. We imagine how things could be better. That can be a very healthy activity. Children love to use their imaginations, and that can be a very helpful thing for them in developing their brains, in developing their minds and their outlook on life. We also make plans for our future. We have dreams about what we would one day like to do, where we would one day like to live. And that can be a healthy thing. Sometimes when we're struggling with very frustrating, difficult circumstances, we can escape by going back to what life was once like. And we can say, you know what, this too will pass. We will one day have things better again. So there is a healthy type of escape. What makes it unhealthy is when it interferes with a couple things. Number one, it interferes with the individual's ability or willingness to take responsibility for their own actions. So instead of doing anything about their problems, They escape into reality, and then that just makes it so they don't feel they need to deal with their problems. It interferes with taking responsibility. It interferes with making realistic decisions in real time, important decisions about their future, about how to resolve situations. So it's a way of avoiding. In some cases, it's denial of the problem. In some cases, it's dissociation from yourself, from the pain, from your circumstances. So it has some very scary type of tendencies. But bottom line, it's unhealthy if it results in me not dealing with life on life's terms, by avoiding life. The other fact about it is it's relying on emotions, not facts, to make decisions. So this makes me feel good, so I will pursue that. I would choose that. Instead of looking at the facts, I will just chase the feeling. So why do people escape into this fantasy world? I think for the vast majority of people who do so, complex trauma is at the core of it. It's really what it's all about. And so you need to understand the complex trauma piece to really appreciate this style of coping. And the issue in complex trauma is a child is in circumstances that aren't fair, that are painful, that aren't safe, and they're trying to fix them, but mom and dad aren't allowing that to happen, or the teacher at school isn't allowing that to happen. So there's no way for them to solve their own problems. Doesn't matter what they try, it doesn't improve their situation. They remain in ongoing pain. And so the brain is looking for ways to escape that problem-filled life, since nothing healthy is working. And so one of the things that the brain comes up with for some people is escaping into a fantasy world. It's a world where they feel safe and happy all the time, where they don't have any fear, they don't have any pain. It's a world where everybody loves them, where everybody treats them and each other with respect. It's a world where all their needs are met. It's a world where they had power, where they weren't powerless. That's the nature of the fantasy world that they create. Now, I should say this. For people in extreme abuse, the brain has tried everything to relieve the abuse, to make the situation better, and nothing has worked. And the abuse is so severe that the brain just takes over in trying to protect the child, and it will actually dissociate from the events that are around that child. So it's a subconscious thing. They're not consciously doing it, and that begins your dissociative disorders. But let's go back to a person that escapes of their own choice to a fantasy world. What you need to understand is that their current situation is creating a lot of negative emotions and pain in their limbic brain. And so what the brain is wanting to do is find something that will overpower the negative limbic brain emotions with positive emotions instantly. And so escaping to a fantasy world is a way to take all those positive emotions and make them feel like they're happening and overpower the negative emotions of their current situation. But then it goes further. What else comes out of complex trauma is this shame piece, where I don't feel good enough. My identity says I am not lovable, I am not valuable, so I live with the pain of constant shame. I don't like myself. And in some cases, I hate myself. And so now people escape to fantasy so they don't have to live in their own skin. so they can imagine a different them where everybody loves them. And then beyond that, in complex trauma, you have many needs that aren't met. And so in the fantasy, you are getting your needs met. And so if you grow up with injustice, where things aren't fair, where one child is favored over the other, where dad doesn't care about justice, just about what he wants, then you can have revenge fantasies. You can imagine yourself being able to execute justice and vengeance on all the people who are perpetrating injustice. And then you create this environment where you're respected and loved unconditionally, where you connect with people, where you fit in and belong, and that is getting your needs met. So complex trauma introduces a whole bunch of different things that all involve painful emotions as the consequence. And so escaping to fantasy becomes a critical piece in many different ways to survive for a person in complex trauma. And so if it's about getting needs met, what can then happen in the person's mind is they begin to think that the fantasy is the solution to their problems. If only I had that, then life would be good. If only I had this, then I would be happy. And so now your fantasy is causing you to believe certain things that are probably lies. So let me take it further. Complex trauma means ongoing pain, ongoing danger, ongoing unmet needs. And so a person then escapes the fantasy on a regular basis in order to have positive emotions, in order to survive. And so they begin to get to a point where they don't want to live in the present at all because it's constantly painful. A large part of their brain is now used to explore their fantasy world, to live there, and it is more enjoyable than their present. And now they do it without even realizing they do it. And it can become their default setting. So that's kind of why it develops. Now let me take it a bit further to show some of the negative consequences that start happening the longer the person uses escaping to fantasy as a coping mechanism. So they, as we have said, begin to think that maybe their fantasies can become reality. And they don't realize that their fantasies contain lies. To them, their fantasy feels so real. And so just for example, a person who is lonely and sad begins to fantasize about having a little puppy. And it just fills their heart with warmth, with love. And they begin to think, if only I have a puppy, I will be happy. And they're convinced it is true. They don't see some of the lies that are part of that fantasy. And so, their fantasy becomes the magical solution to all of their problems. And then they get mad at people who try to burst their bubble, who try to get them to see reality. And so what you see is they now want to see through rose-colored glasses. They want their fantasy to be true more than anything, even if it means denying reality. And that is scary. Some keep chasing fantasies of magic and never do the hard work of life. They never accept responsibility to make decisions to better their life. They keep chasing the next magic fantasy. And they can do that for years. The longer you stay in fantasy, the more distorted you get, and the more you ultimately do damage to yourself and to others. Yes, it makes you feel good in the moment, but it is starting to create lots of negative consequences. There is a study, or some studies that have been done, that suggest that escapism, people that escape to fantasy, are often depressed. But the longer they stay in fantasy and not deal with their life, the more depressed they get. And so it starts with depression, but then it feeds even greater depression. More than that, what they have seen in other studies is that people who are attracted to psychopaths and narcissists are often people with a high tendency to escape to fantasy. Because a narcissist and a psychopath, they are very charming up front. They are very good at manipulating people and making them think they're loved when they're only being used. And so people with a high level of escaping to fantasy have a greater risk of being attracted to psychopaths and narcissists. Now, the next thing I want you to think about is in understanding yourself. If escape to fantasy has been something that you do, what triggers it today? What would cause you today to go into a fantasy world? So let me just give you a couple things. Stress, frustration, conflict, problems, pain, anger, anxiety, painful emotions, discontent, boredom, loneliness. Anytime oxytocin is released in your brain, you meet somebody and you fall in love. That releases oxytocin. And that can trigger you to go into a fantasy about that person. So what that basically says is you can get triggered to go into your fantasy many times a day whenever you feel negative emotions or even positive emotions. So study yourself to become aware of your triggers.